Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum, FP&A Strategies and Insights to Fuel Growth. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Bill.com. Our sponsors are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active on social media, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us on X, formerly Twitter, at Argyle Exec Forum. Also, be sure to subscribe to Argyle on YouTube for exclusive access to all our past events. I would like to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we have received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today. And we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we want to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thanks again for joining us today. Now, let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Matt Pileski, Regional Chief Financial Officer, Arthur J. Gallagher. We are super excited to have Matt for his opening keynote presentation titled Driving Strategic Decisions by Enhancing Leader Mental Models with Data and Repetition. Welcome, Matt. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. Happy to be here today. And again, want to say that, look, the title is FBA Strategies and Insights to Fueling Growth. My topic today is, is mental models. How do we influence decisions by enhancing those models through a lot of data, which we have, and repetition? So, yeah. Okay, so agenda. We're going to cover what is a mental model versus what's a business model. How are they different? How does that cause things? What are some of the psychological biases that impact the models? How does our communication style affect how our messages are received? How do we nudge towards a growth mindset using repetition? How do we present numbers with consistency and focus? And then kind of going back to that, repetition and habits and some takeaways. So that's what we'll cover today. Okay. Now, a mental model, really, we all have different mental models. I think this is extremely important to notice. It's influenced by like how we grew up. If you're an oldest child, if you're a middle child, that's going to affect how you see the world, your successes, your failures. You learn a lot of things. One of my favorite stories is, a cat that touches a hot stove will never touch that stove again, but they'll also never touch a cold one. So like, what are those things in our model that we need to understand? And then let's relate that to our business model, which is really our company's plan for making money. Like, who are our customers? What do we offer? And how do we make money? So you see here, like, what we always try to do in finance is look at how do we do that through when individuals or groups have conflicting, but we use our drivers here. So we're trying to grow the top line. We're trying to grow the bottom line. We're looking at those ratios. And then our tools are really mastering those drivers that show up in our P&L. So we'll cover that today. Okay, so psychological biases impacting mental models. First one I'll cover is the fundamental attribution error. And this is where we're looking at overemphasizing personality traits and underestimating situational factors. Well, he failed because he's lazy, he didn't do it, it's his fault, versus, well, maybe there were some external factors that impacted that. There's the self-serving bias. Well, when we look at ourselves, it's like, well, when we succeed, it's because I'm smart. But when I fail, that's someone else's fault. It was unfair. Um, and then finally is our learned helplessness. It's a state where people get into this whole thing, and this applies to us when we're giving numbers. No matter what I do, the numbers don't say the right thing. They're stacked against us. It's just unfair. And we really want to make sure we're overcoming these psychological biases when we're presenting numbers and recognizing that they're there. When we look at our mental models, and three of the business roles that I want to cover are really the sales mindset, which is really focused on growing revenues. And like they don't care how much it costs to grow revenues, they just want to grow revenues at any cost. An operations mindset, where they're focused on compliance, getting the job done, but they're not really considered so much on growing the top line as they are controlling the bottom line and maybe a little bit risk adverse. Then there's the owner mindset, which when we're dealing with employees, we're not really dealing with owners, but this is really the risk for reward and saying like, how do I spend money to make money? How to make those strategic high risk decisions that are going to have rewards. But this is really more an investor mindset. So, I mean, that's what, as you're thinking through this, we always want to try to shift from more of a sales and operation mindset into that owner mindset. How do we generate return on investment? Okay. So this is one of my favorite stories here because I actually feel this. The doctor that nobody listened to. So there was a doctor, as Dr. Brandt was his name, and he's top of the field. He's a surgeon, and he'd make recommendations on cancer. And he'd skip straight to the data and say, the data says, let's monitor this every 6 months. You don't need anything. You're low risk category. We'll do another biopsy in 2 years. And what he found was all his patients would look at the data and say, no, I think I want the surgery. And he couldn't understand why his patients weren't listening to him. And just couldn't understand why. And then he talked to somebody at Harvard who said, like, look, you're looking at this the wrong way. Your patients want to know, one, they're coming to you, they've already kind of been convinced that they're sick. If they're going and seeing you, they're expecting the worst. And they're not, when you hit them with data, they're not ready to receive it. What you need to do is have an emotional conversation first, where ask them how they're feeling, what they're worried about, what this diagnosis means to them. Give them a little reassurance first, then they're going to be more likely to accept the data. And I feel like this happens to us a lot because we're like looking at the numbers and we're like, obviously they mean X or Y. And then when we present them, somebody comes to a different conclusion. So I think if we want people to look at our data and take our recommendations, we need to understand that relationships and conversations matter. And this comes from a book that I read that I like. That's from Charles Duhigg, Supercommunicators. But first, it's like, what type of conversation are we having? What's this really about? As a practical conversation. This is where you're skipping to the data. Emotional conversations. Like the best example of this is between spouses, right? You may come home from work and you're tired and you want to complain about your day. Well, your spouse, if they start switching to solutions, that's really frustrating because you're looking for emotional support, guidance, and they're trying to be practical. That causes conflict in the conversation. Social conversations. Who are we? We're trying to understand if you think of like the news networks, like if you're watching CNN, you might be getting one narrative. If you're watching Fox News, you might be getting a narrative. But who's on your side? Where are they coming from? We want to be perceived as we're on their side. So know which conversation you're having, what the person's trying to identify. That's going to help you converse better. And then as you say this, the more we're like, as opposed to telling people, ask more questions, listen more than you talk, then your data will speak for you. Make sure you're matching your emotional styles and your understanding. Here's what people want to do. And then encourage a learning conversation. This is growth, what we're getting to. Let's talk about, well, how do we use these numbers to help us grow and help us achieve? And if you start positioning yourself like this, this is going to make you a better partner. Okay. So, and then as you think about this, how do you overcome the biases like attribution error, self-serving error, learned helplessness? You can kind of, by being a better listener and positioning and matching, that puts you in a better position to overcome these biases we talked about in the beginning. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about every time I hear someone say, oh, it can't be done, we can't do it, it's impossible. I think back when I was 26 years old, I ran my first marathon. I was extremely proud of myself for running a marathon. I was really tired. And then I listened to this one podcast once where I heard David Goggins, and he said, look, in 2005, one of his friends was killed in combat. He wanted to do something to help them. And he went out and he's like, I'm going to figure out how to run the world's toughest race in honor of this person, raise money. And he goes out and he has to do a 100-mile race. And he runs 70 miles and he hits a wall. He didn't even think it was possible he could run another 30, and he pushed himself to run another 40. But you can always, this guy taught himself how to read by just copying the textbooks over and over again, just doing it. That's how he taught himself how to read. When he joined the military, he joined as a Navy SEAL. He was 100 pounds overweight when he applied, and 4 people laughed at him and said, hey, we're not going to do it. The fifth person said, well, if you can do this by this date, if you can lose 100 pounds in 3 months, we'll take you. And we figured out how to do that just by repetition, eating the same thing every day, getting the same exercise, all of that, holding yourself accountable. So when you think that you can't do anything more, you actually can if you put your mind to it. Just never give up, having that positive attitude and saying, how do we grow? Find your silver lining, push yourself, and try to be supportive and push your leaders too. Okay, so now let's switch to financial data. And this would be like our standard P&L. And this is where I always cringe, where like they asked me for P&L, so I gave them P&L. And then what happens? Your leader looks at this P&L and they say, oh, what's the first thing they do? They go to that learned helplessness. Why are home office costs up 30%? And then you end up spending the whole conversation on why some calculation it's not one of their drivers, how it was unfair to them, how it's not fair. And then they'll go and they're like, I don't understand why revenues can be up 29%, but we're missing budget by 39. The budget's wrong. I don't understand this ratio. And then when you present numbers without a story, you're reacting to their biases, their mental models. They're going to look where they want to look, and they're going to put you on the defensive. So again, trying to get this in a story format, I'll kind of walk you through how I've learned to kind of present things as we go. So we always start with our drivers, and our drivers, again, are going to influence our mental model, but we think the top line influences everything. So when we looked at commissions and fees, we're like, let's really understand this and let's break this down. What are our new customers? What are our lost customers? What's our non-recurring timing that's impacting the revenues? And what's kind of our market lift, which we'll say is inflation or just change in customers year over year. So it's pretty simple format. Then we're going to focus on the year to date in the remaining year. Because look, is when you go to the month, there's a lot of noise in the month, and this leads to consistency. If you're saying like, look, here's where year to date, here's what's coming, here's where we're going to be at the end of the year, this leads to people seeing the same thing month over month. And then it's a simple story. If you sell more new business, you're doing good. So like, how do we make that new business better? If you lose more new business, that's bad. What are you doing to retain your customers? Now we're having a meaningful conversation on the numbers as opposed to reacting to whatever customers your leader wants to ask you. And then add additional context. What are we comparing to? How do we raise the bar? How does this, this again, puts you in a place to be a good conversationalist. Then we do get to the P&L here, and we start with a simple P&L. And look here, as we're doing this, in this simple P&L that's got revenues, comp, OpEx, we focus on the growth rates. So this is, we don't even have a budget in here. We just have current year versus prior year. Where are we growing? What are the rates and what are the relationships? What's the revenue growth versus the comp growth versus the OpEx growth? And then that leads to my bottom line growth. Then after we go through where we are kind of year to date, we layer in the full year numbers. As we layer in the full year numbers, then you can kind of see again, these numbers will shift every month, but the ratios should kind of stay the same. So you're really starting to drive in these ratios, which really are the business model. What's the relationship of revenue growth to comp growth to OPEX growth? Knowing those ratios, that is your business model. So you're using this to reinforce this. Then you also have a budget. And we find there's noise in the monthly budgets. So look at the budget as an annual target. And when you look at the annual target for the budget, now you're like, okay, one, I know, hey, we're growing. We know what our bottom line contribution is. But if we're missing the corporate target, we also know that. Now we can speak out of both sides. We can say, here's how much we're growing. Here's what we're contributing. But here's what we're doing relative to what we did when we set the budget. And here's kind of how we can call some audibles to game change to react to if we're missing the budget, or just if you get called out on that, what you want to say about it. Okay. So again, it's reinforcing that model, grow revenues faster than expenses, big picture thinking, things in terms of annual numbers and ratios, know your annual budget, and if you can hit your targets. So again, we're reinforcing all these things with how we present this. Okay. So then command of the numbers using management form, what we also like to do is just type it up, and AI can help with this. Type up your summary of your P&L and start with our number one driver is our commissions and fees. So we go into that, we talk about what the growth rates are, we talk about different segments are going, we talk about the major components, the new business and the lost business and retention. If you break it down and then break it down by segments, that really helps them develop their own model, and they see this month over month. You're really influencing that model. Then for the bottom line, we go through segment by segment, and we talk about the drivers in there. But now we've prioritized, so revenues are number one, and then the comp and OPEX kind of come after that, and they're going to adjust based on how we're doing on the revenue growth. Okay, limits in action, math and comp. It's just math. Everybody always asks us for investments, and comp is the number one investment. So to hold the margin flat, comp can grow at the same rate as revenue. That's just math, right? And then, so the higher we grow revenues, the more money we have to spend. This gives us flexibility. So that's basically, and we're trying to grow revenues faster than we're trying to grow expenses, capturing economies of scale. Again, this is helping build out that model. And then we also want to make the point of investment dollars are scarce. When we evaluate investments based on the quality of the investment, not based on what your P&L says, but whether we think this is going to provide a return. Because if you're generating a return over the long run, that's going to be good. So that's a little bit how we go there. Now, presenting data influence. These are, again, it's another way of just showing all those same metrics there. And again, we're focused on the annual numbers to stay consistent. These are my locations. These are, we can see what's bigger, what's smaller, what are our drivers. So it's like, look, how much time should I spend on location A versus location E? You can kind of see the magnitude of the size. Then we also look on the marginal changes. Are we getting better or getting worse? So not only do we show the revenue growth, but we show what was the revenue growth compared to last year. What's the margin? What are we making? What's the margin compared to last year? Is it going up or down? Are we diluting? Because really this metric here, the marginal change, is probably the most important direct. Like, which way are you going? Is it getting hotter or colder? That's probably more important than the actual temperature, although both are there. We look at our key metrics here, and then again, these are just numbers. They don't tell you everything, but how does this compare to expectations? How does it compare to peers? How does it compare to external conditions? You look at all these things, now you have data that really can help influence people. So now I'm going to, I like to say the good, the bad, the ugly here, because we really need to make sure the buyer's formula that we're introducing ourselves as experts. And one, you want to say like, look, you want to be confident. You want to I see these numbers all the time. I look at them all the time. They're the same. So then what are we trying to accomplish? what are the obvious ways to fail? And it's obvious, it's like, well, look, if we takes money to spend money, like obviously we got to invest. But then we got to talk about some counterintuitive things. Like, well, if we spend money on this, it doesn't really work. You think it would, but we tried, it didn't work. We've seen this movie before. Then we say like, well, here's some actions, here's some less. And I think the important thing is after you go through all this, where you're kind of scenario planning with options, handing over autonomy. Just be like, this is just my insight. Now let me know what you want to do, and I can support you. And if they're still going the wrong way, then kind of redirect them to like, let's stay within the lines. Here's what we're trying to do. And this is how it ties back into your model. If you know your performance relative to your model, you're going to speak intelligently. And even when you're underperforming, speaking that way and knowing how the cycles go, what's going to change, I mean, you're going to make better decisions, and you're going to be able to support those decisions. So all of this is important. Then linking to strategy. This is SWT framework. I borrowed this from a source called Scaling Up. But it's like, we always tend to look at our weaknesses first, but the first thing you should always look at is, what are your strengths? Are the numbers showing the things I'm strong at? Are we leveraging our competitive advantages? Then our weaknesses. Are our numbers showing my weaknesses? Am I addressing weaknesses either through, and like, look, sometimes you just need to cut. Sometimes you can make your weaknesses better, but sometimes you need to outsource it because somebody can do it better than you and you can just pay somebody. Or sometimes you just need to divest, and like, we need to have honest conversations about our weaknesses. And then the third is like, what are the industry trends? And if you think in this framework, this kind of knows, what am I doing relative to others? Which way am I trending? Am I up or down? Like, I like to use the weather as an analogy. Is it the summer? It's hot, because if you have good numbers in the summer, it's like, well, big deal. If you have good numbers in the winter, that's a little more impressive, but sometimes you got to expect lower results in the winter months. And then are we in the spring or fall, where it's kind of not in either of those seasons? Okay. We'll go into here the power of habit. I like to quote the chief repeating officer. This is like, I have to say it over and over again. I find a lot of things I recommend it. When I make a recommendation, I get rejected the first time, almost every time. And over time, then what happens is 3 months later, someone's picking my idea, they're pitching it themselves, and they don't even know it came from me. And that doesn't even really matter, because if you're controlling the content, that's probably more important. But saying the same things over and over again, and recognize when communication is taking place, like, got to make sure it happens. And then building habits. Like, this is a lot of the reinforcement, and Duhigg talks about it in his Power of Habit book. But it's a trigger a cue is a trigger that initiates behavior. Then you have a routine to overcome that, and then you develop habits out of doing these things where you get reinforcement. So again, if we can be creating rewards, like, the last thing you want to do is every time you have a conversation with somebody, tell them how bad they are, and then they're not going to want to talk to you anymore, because you're making them feel bad. They want to talk to the people that make them feel good. Like, how do you create habits where we're making people feel good, even though what we're trying to do is growth and push ourselves, and there are tough things that need to happen. And then this is classical operant conditioning. Again, it's like, okay, how do we create reinforcement by giving praise? That's positive reinforcement. If you're criticizing somebody every time they're talking to them, like, they're going to shut down. So it's like, how do we use these numbers? Because we have the numbers, we have the score, and how we present them, we could present them in a positive way or a negative way. And I think, we can't just be like, we can't be cheerleaders who cheer on everything. So we have to, but even when you point out the negative things, you can point out negative things in a positive way that encourages responses to address them. Okay. Influencing a system mental model here, right? We got two scenarios here. We got an outcome-based mindset and a process-based mindset. We got 3 lotto tickets, each cost $1, payoff is 100, only one winner. Do you make the bet? Then you got 10,000 lotto tickets, each cost $1, payoff is 100. Do you make the bet? I think the important thing here is the classic outcome is like, just find that one winner and then go figure out what they did right. But if they didn't make good bets, That's not, because if the person who's betting on scenario A who's losing, he's got a 2 out of 3 chance, he's still making a good bet. So understanding the underlying processes, why we're making decisions, and how that shows up in the numbers, because they don't always show up linearly. They show up in, like, that classic hockey stick. When it works, you get 100. When it didn't work, you lost 33. But if we're making more good dollar bets than bad dollar bets, like, this is, again, understanding your model, and that, like, it's not going to be linear. You're not going to get the same result every time. And the last thing we want is lowest common denominator, where we try to make everything the same, because it's easier for us to explain, not because that's the best business model. Okay. A couple last things here as I wrap up. As you're making recommendations, always use choice architecture. Don't just give them the answer, give them choices, see which ones they pick. You can frame your choices with different tools, saying other people are doing it, framing it as a loss. But think about how you're creating your choices. And generally, I like 3 choices, because I think that's simple for the brain to understand. It's A, B, C, and like, this will help people facilitate decisions. So as we go through key takeaways here, know your audience and their mental model. Know how their biases impact how they interpret your information. Make sure you're building relationships through conversations, recognizing what kind of conversation you're having. Those emotional and social conversations are just as important as your practical conversations if you want to be heard. Just try to anchor that growth mindset. Like, when everyone says, "Oh, I can't do it," like, there's somebody who can. Just keep doing it, pushing, repetition, trying harder. Let's present our data clearly in kind of a story format, and just repeat, repeat, repeat. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Great. All right, Matt, here's a question from the audience. What are some of the biggest challenges you face when trying to align stakeholders' mental models with strategic financial goals?
I think you got to address this in the planning stage, and you got to understand, well, what are the strategies they're trying to do, and put some planning into how are you measuring that? How does that relate? Because if you try to redo a reactive to that link, you're probably going to fail. But if you put some planning in on the front end, and then again, I do a lot of gardening, be like, okay, do you agree with how we're looking at this? Do you agree with this link? Does this make sense? So I think it all gets into that planning stage, really understanding what the strategy is and how you're linking it to your numbers.
Great. And I think we can squeeze in one more question. How do you tailor your communication approach when speaking to the C suite versus cross functional teams?
I think, again, it all starts with listening. When we're talking to C-suite, you want to understand your expectations and what they want to get from you. And you may be saying, like, look, just like, what subsets of data you're presenting. When you're talking to the C-suite, you're obviously typically going really big picture with maybe a couple examples that are at the micro. When you're talking to cross-functional, you may be focusing on some of the micro things that they want. Start there and then go to the macro. Well, here's the impact. Here's why this might work. Here's why this might not work. But I think toggling how you're going micro and macro probably makes a big difference there.
Great. And I think we can squeeze one more in if it's a quick answer. Um, what does it take to move from simply sharing numbers to actually telling a story that resonates and drives action?
Again, I think this is where you have to plan your story, and you have to be like, you start with your story, then do your numbers support it? And either they do or they don't. And if they don't support it, you got to tweak your story. But I think you have to start with that story and then say, do the numbers support it or not? This is kind of the scientific method. Start with your hypothesis.
Great. Well, thanks again, Matt, for an excellent keynote. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Our next session will begin at 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time, which will be a panel discussion titled Leveraging AI and Automation for Smarter Financial Planning. Please click the join button that will appear on your screen to be redirected to the next session, and we look forward to seeing you there.